Welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Aldi. I'll serve as the faculty host today. It's thrilling to see a full room on what is the last week of the semester. So appreciate you coming in to learn a little bit more about decarbonization with us today. I'd also like to thank our friends and colleagues who are joining us on the Zoom. We're really excited to have with us today Dr. Leon Clarke for his talk on the challenges to rapid low-carbon economic transitions. Leon is the Director of Decarbonization Pathways at the Bezos Earth Fund. Leon joined the Earth Fund from the University of Maryland, where he served as the Research Director for the Center for Global Sustainability. He also held a joint appointment with the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. He led the Integrated Human Earth System Science Group at the Joint Global Change Research Institute, which was a collaboration of both the University of Maryland and Pacific Northwest National Lab. Leon has served as an author and coordinating lead author for the IPCC, the National Climate Assessment, and the National Research Council. Leon, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Great. Thank you. All right. Is it working? Is this working? Yep. Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you, Joe. Thanks for the invitation to be here. It's an honor to be here and great to see so many people the day after Thanksgiving. And I didn't realize it was the last day or last week of the semester. That's great. So I am going to talk about just what's written here. Just as a little introduction before I do that, let me just say where I'm from. So I'm now with the Bezos Earth Fund, which I believe is the largest philanthropy in the climate and nature space at this point. But I will also note, for what it's worth, that funding from the philanthropic space on climate and nature has increased dramatically over the last several years. So there's a number of very large investments that are going into philanthropy, from philanthropy into climate. Hang on, let me just put on my timer here to make sure I don't spend too much time talking. But $10 billion to be spent over 10 years. That's what's kind of interesting about this is some philanthropies are sitting with an endowment that lasts over some long period of time. We're supposed to spend all of it over 10 years, ostensibly about $1 billion a year needs to be spent on these spaces. Focus is climate and nature, as I mentioned, with equity, justice is sort of a cross-cutting issue. And to date, we've spent about $2 billion. The majority of that has actually been more in the, well, that's not true. We've done a lot of it in energy, but more recently, a lot of our focus has been in the nature space. And we're still working through a lot of the challenges about where exactly to focus in some of our future investments in the energy space. So it's a good time for this conversation. So just some of the key points that I'm going to make today that I want to focus on. The first one is that the transition right now to a low carbon energy system is happening. It's happening now. Second is we don't want to think about this as climate mitigation. We need to think about this as an economic transformation, an economic transition, because that's where the challenges lie and that's where the needs are. The third point then is that what that means is that climate policy is not just environmental policy. It's trade policy, it's fiscal policy, it's labor, it's all those issues. Those are the issues that are important now. And then finally, we really need to be pushing, like everything, economic thinking needs to be evolving quickly to this new environment. The question is, how fast is it? Is it going there, but we'd like to move it a little more quickly. So let me start with this first point. The transition is happening now. And this is probably a pretty sophisticated crowd, I would assume, but I'm still going to go through some of these basic points. So let's just get this on the table. So I guess to step back, I think we're at a point in the evolution of our energy system and in climate where it's no longer a question about if we're going to be transitioning to a low carbon economy. It's really a question of when. And the major reason for that is technology. You could say policy causes technology and so on and so forth, but the bottom line is the measurable thing is technology. So this is a chart from the IPCC, and these charts are everywhere now. Everyone's putting out charts like this. On the upper row, it's showing what the costs are for a bunch of different important technologies. Got wind, solar, different types of wind, batteries. And then on the bottom is showing deployment. And of course, when you look at the top row, the obvious thing is that a lot of it's pointed down, right? So the costs have come down dramatically for these technologies in ways that I think weren't anticipated. And in fact, even if you look at those that are electricity, there's that gray bar. That gray bar is the sort of comparable fossil generation, right? So the point being that generation from low carbon sources is as cheap or cheaper in many instances now around the world than it is to generate from fossil. There's all sorts of nuances about these being intermittent power and so on and so forth. That's going to be important over time, and it is important now in places where, particularly in places where it's hard to even supply power in a consistent way. But the bottom line is that the economics are now in favor of low carbon technology. So it's happening, it's gonna happen. And of course, then you see these incredible exponential growth curves on all of these technologies. And that's what's on the bottom row. So technology is really the driver of this at this point. And of course, then what you see, and this is another core part of it, well, technology is going that way. Well, where's actual capital going? So this capital expenditures in energy. And what you can see, of course, is that renewables are going, clean energy, I should say, is going up rapidly. This is where the investment is now going. It's going into clean energy. So the private sector sees this. This is where it's happening. So this is sort of a, I've worked in energy for, wow, a long time now that I think about it, 35 years or 30 years, something like that. And in climate for the last 20, this is great news, right? I mean, it used to be, the whole point was, oh my gosh, we're going to have to use higher cost. This is the notion of environmental economics. You use higher cost sources of production, but they're cleaner, and then you do better. But in fact, we're moving to a space where this is actually just a competitive goal now to invest in this way. So that's great, and that's really encouraging. And of course, at the same time, what you're seeing is that there's policies all around the world that are being put in that are specifically around climate. And that includes its pledges and so forth. And it's not just at the national level, but of course, there's a ton of subnational action that's going on. And in fact, it's interesting. I used to work in this space in the US, and I always found it interesting during the last administration. There was an impression when I would talk to, a lot of what I've done is international. I would talk to international colleagues and they would say, oh, you are doing so much under the Obama administration. But there were actually a lot of challenges at that time, including Congress. And then you did nothing during the last administration on climate. But in fact, what happened in the last administration was the fact that the federal government wasn't doing something galvanized states and cities and businesses to do something. So there was actually a lot of action that happened, but in a very different way than people see internationally. But nonetheless, a lot of stuff happening at the subnational level. And then of course, it's not just about carbon prices and EV mandates, it's about border taxes, trade agreements and steel, the IRA, which is many, many things. Here you've got India's pushing for EV investments. You're talking about how do you close the skills gap. So now the policy space is a very different space than those of us who came up thinking through sort of traditional environmental economics would think about it. It's about a much broader space of policy, but there's a ton of stuff going on. And the private sector is also engaging. This is showing private sector, company commitments, and you can see things like the Science-Based Targets Initiative, where companies are signing up to reach science-based targets, that is, targets that are consistent with the science and will get you to net zero or be consistent with a 1.5 degree pathway. There's the Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is a bunch of financial institutions focused on trying to get to net zero. Now that we can have a nuanced discussion about what's actually going on with these, but the point is there's this sort of environment of increased engagement and action around this. And I just wanted to put up this quote from the Secretary Yellen. And I think it highlights kind of where some of the thinking is at this point. So if you look up here, by doing so, basically transition to a clean energy economy will realize significant economic opportunities in high growth industries building economic resilience, but I want to emphasize in creating good paying jobs across the country. The transition to a clean economy has massive economic stakes. And if you look at the bottom, we need to mitigate the risks, but capitalize on the economic opportunity. So the rhetoric around this is moving into this space of economic opportunity. People are seeing this way. And if you look around the world, this is actually how countries are thinking about climate and the clean energy transition. It is, in fact, potentially an economic opportunity. Okay, so that's in some sense kind of a good news story. Climate technology is better. We're moving on this transition. There's policies everywhere. Everyone sees that there's actually an opportunity. It's making its way into all sorts of different elements of the policy space. So are we on track? Well, are we on track? Yeah, well, okay. So we're on track to somewhere. Here's a couple of opinions about what we're on track to. This is from Climate Action Tracker, which is great for those who don't know it. They track all these policies and then they publish where they would lead you. But just to highlight a couple of parts of this, this is what a 1.5 degree pathway looks like. And of course, I always have to mention, as someone who spent time on this, that's the median value. But of course, 1.5 doesn't actually mean 1.5. It means that 50% of the probability is below and 50% is above. But anyways, this is what that looks like. And then here's where you get into sort of blue to where current policies would take you. Now, neither of those is really realistic. Are we not going to get more policies and actions? We'll probably get more policies and actions. We've been underestimating in some sense what's happening. Are we going to get down here? Probably not. So then there's somewhere in the intermediate is potentially where we might actually be landing. Who knows? You'll get these projections where people will say, well, we're headed towards 3 degrees. I mean, that's totally dependent on what happens going forward. So this is, Climate Action Tracker showed what happens as we have the 2030 targets, pledges and targets, optimistic scenario gets down to 1.8. Who knows? Somewhere in there. This is another perspective on this. It's actually two, but the main one here is from what's called the Inevitable Policy Response. This is a project that tracks actual policies on the ground in a whole bunch of different countries and then projects what future policies would be. And this is for private sector. So if you're dealing with the public sector, you might want to be saying, how do we get to 1.5? If you're in the private sector, what you're saying is, what's actually going to happen? I need to do my planning around that. So they're in some sense policy takers. And I used to do work for companies, and I remember one very large company. This was an oil company. It's got to be 15 years ago. They had an implied carbon price for their company-wide projections. The very big oil company. For their company-wide projections, they have to have sort of a scenario that they use from corporate planning. It had a global carbon price increasing over time. I mean, not that they were saying it would actually be a price, but it was a proxy for policy because they didn't assume we wouldn't have any policy. They assumed we would have policy. And that's what they're thinking about. So these folks have been doing this. They get us towards that kind of middle range. I think they estimate something like 1.8 degrees or something like that. So the point is, we're probably not, quote, on track to median of 3 degrees. We're probably on track towards something better than that. We don't know what, but we're probably not on track to 1.5. So we're moving, but we still need to be moving faster, right? We're not moving fast enough. We're maybe not as bad as people have thought, but we're still not in good shape by any stretch, particularly since the motto at this point is that every 1/10 of a degree matters, right? It's not just about whether you get to 1.5. It's simply about whether you can reduce emissions. And then this here in blue is the IEA. I can't remember. It's like aggressive policy scenario or something like that. But it's assuming basically that countries come through in all their pledges, and then there's some increasing or extrapolated pledges going forward. And that gets us down in roughly the same range. So again, I think it's just important as you look at projections to understand, well, one, that it's not between doing nothing and hitting 1.5. Something in between is probably realistic. But even if you look at that, we're not on the track to be nearly as rapid as we would like. So why not? So that's what I want to focus on. So again, we've got this good news in a way. Technology's there. In some sense, we've got what we need. Actually, I'll make another point on that. I used to come from a background that did a lot of work in integrated assessment modeling and analysis, basically looking at these pathways. And the sense was, and in a lot of the sense actually in that community, is that, well, you know what? We've got the near term solved. That's pretty easy because we've got PVs and batteries and wind and so forth. So the near term's easy. You know, in the next 10 or 20 years, what's really hard is when we need to get out that last little bit. You know, when you got to get it out of industry, you got to get it out of air travel. How do you actually get out that last bit of carbon? How do you remove carbon for the atmosphere? That's where the real challenge is. I don't necessarily believe that anymore. And I think really the challenges we face now are how to rapidly evolve our economies. Because this is not just about mitigation, it's about economic transformation. How do we rapidly evolve economies? And that is not easy. And that's the reason we're not moving more rapidly. So I think it's useful when you think about this to think about two things, or you know, splice the space into two. One is building the new. What are the challenges that we face in building the new stuff? You know, I've got the classic kinds of pictures there. And then the other is transitioning from the old. And in reality, this transitioning from the old is where a lot of the challenges come. So, and I'll go through both. But I think a lot of the challenges, particularly the political economy challenges, are coming out of transitioning out of the old. But there's really serious questions there. And I think at times there's a sense, well, let's just build this and, you know, that'll go away. This is cheaper. But there's a lot of real sort of fair and, yeah, there's a lot of fair just transition issues that are, and just transition issues that I'll go through that are involved with getting out of the old. So let's just start with the new. So, you know, the first thing is, how do you finance this? It's a lot of money that needs to be invested. And so this is from this Songway-Stern report. And just for the emerging developing economies, they're talking about by 2030, just for the energy transformation, 1.3 to 1.7 trillion a year that needs to be invested. And to step back on this, I'll note that climate philanthropy, I was just looking at this morning, total climate philanthropy is about, the estimates I saw were between 8 and 13 billion a year. Okay. So that seems like so much money, and it's a lot in philanthropy, but it's not a lot compared to the scale of the challenge. And I had mentioned this to some folks I met with this morning, but we often get asked in philanthropy to serve as sort of catalytic capital, and to take sort of junior positions and increase investment and so forth. Well, that's a non-viable use of philanthropy in the long run because there's just not enough money for that. So nonetheless, so this is the kind of number you see. That's just for emerging development economies. It's for the energy transition. If you think about all of the funding that's needed for climate, including resilience and adaptation stuff in forests and so forth, then you're talking a lot more, right? So you're talking $3-4 trillion a year that's ostensibly needed. This is from CPI. And here's what the total climate finance is now. I think I've seen two estimates, like 600 billion, 800 billion, something like that. So this is the first issue, is how do you get the money to do that? And you know, in the U.S., we've put in the IRA as a way to incentivize a lot of action. This may not be as viable for, say, Indonesia. You know, the ability to have the fiscal space to move into this. I mean, this is obviously a lot of this is private, but to be able to sort of support this is a lot harder in a lot of the emerging economies and developing economies. But here's the first issue is this, right? And so then this is obviously not just public finance, it's private finance as well. A lot of the work that happens in philanthropy now is trying to figure out how to get private finance into this game in a much more effective way, particularly in emerging and developing economies. How do you actually make it worth it? And there's a ton of issues. There's all sorts of risks, currency and political risks. Everyone complains about a lack of project pipelines. So there's a lot of money that could do it, but there isn't actually the pipeline of projects to do it. There's the capacity of local institutions. So do you actually have the entrepreneurs or whatever the businesses on the ground? And then, of course, the inability of public and private financial institutions to work together. The MDBs have trouble leveraging private capital. And private capital folks, as I mentioned this also this morning, for the folks I talked to, but one of my colleagues was formerly at BlackRock, head of sustainability there, and he makes the point that private sector people aren't getting up in the morning wishing they could work with the World Bank and the development banks. They actually think about things a little differently. So these are all, there's all these issues to getting private finance flowing. So I thought I would sprinkle in some of the stuff we're doing at the Earth Fund as we go along. So one thing that we're doing focused in this is something called the Allied Climate Partners. And we're not unique. I think many philanthropies are trying to work on this private finance area. What it does, we put in 25 million. It's a fund that's, I think, raising 250 million. It'll be doing early project prep work, environmental assessments, licensing and so forth, taking some sort of equity share, then selling that off as a project moves forward, hopefully having enough hits that it kind of replenishes this and can keep it going forward. That's kind of a classic kind of style of philanthropic support, trying to pilot a good idea, see if it can get legs and move it forward, but also focusing heavily on this notion of how do you get private capital into this space. Point here, though, is finance is one of the biggest topics that you hear now. How do you get that? And then, of course, countries often don't have the fiscal space. And then to use the same slide, or did I use the slide? Yeah, I did use the slide. So that's one set of challenges. How do you get the finance? But then there's just all the challenges. Now we've got all these questions about what do you do about trade, right? Now you're going to have all these supply chain issues. How do you set up this structure so that you're not just reliant on one country for your supply chains as you move to this green transition? That's a big issue. How do you actually think about what you're going to do about the skills gap? So we hear this over and over that we need to be moving to this transition, but we don't actually have the workforce to make that happen. So there's a whole bunch of challenges just around this notion of moving the economies in this direction. How do you, again, get the money from a government to be investing in the right ways, right? So India wants to push for EV investment. How do they do that? These are a lot of the kinds of questions that are actually coming up today. They're just kind of nitty-gritty questions about labor. They're nitty-gritty questions about fiscal policy, nitty-gritty questions about trade, both for individual countries or for the global trade regime. What do you do about the WTO? How does it need to change? These are the kinds of questions that are actually out there. And what I want to emphasize a little bit is that these are not sort of the traditional environmental economics questions. When you come from the environmental economics background, you might be talking first about internalizing an externality. Let's put in a carbon price. Maybe you might do tradable permits. It's a way to think about it. Then you start thinking about how do we reuse the revenue from carbon prices. Maybe then you start thinking about doing mandates like renewable portfolio standards, EV mandates, but of course they're not efficient, but maybe that's okay because I might get at other market failures and so forth. But that all falls in this sort of classic space. This is about labor, this is about trade. This is about fiscal policy. It's a whole different set of issues. And that's because this is an issue not of environment. As one of my colleagues, Indian colleague had put it, environmental transformation is economic transformation. And that means we need the whole economics community engaged in this, not just the environmental economists. And that's happening increasingly, but probably not rapidly enough. Okay, so then let's talk about getting out of the old. And I think this is super important. And it's important both for sort of justice and fairness reasons and moral reasons, but also political economy reasons, because this is where a lot of the resistance comes from. So it's both of those at once. First thing, stranded assets. So this is from the IPCC, and 200 gigawatts of fossil fuel electricity will need to be retired prematurely after 2030 to limit to 2 degrees. 1.5 would be more. If you limit warming to 2 degrees, the discounted economic impacts of stranded assets, including unburned fossil reserves, could be as high as 1 to 4 trillion from 2015 to 2050, and about 40% of that is unburned fossil assets. So there's just a lot of stranded assets. And how do you deal with, what do you do about stranded assets? How do you think about paying those off? So one thing we're doing, to give another example, we're involved in something called the Energy Transition Accelerator, which is something we've been doing with the administration. And there we're looking at tradable permits, which has all sorts of both good sides to it and challenges to it, but how to do that, to think about how to make it so that the capital stack, to make it so that the money that you need to close down a coal-fired power plant is actually there. If you've got an operating coal plant, you've got an asset. How do you retire an asset early? How do you make that make economic sense? Frankly, you're doing it for a carbon reason. So somehow you need to find a way to bring that into the equation. And so that's something that we've been working on. So stranded assets. Okay, government revenues. So a lot of economies get a lot of their revenue out of fossil. So India, 18% of government revenue comes off of fossil, on the demand, on the supply. How do you replace that? So this isn't just a justice or a political economy issue. This is a fiscal issue. It's a big issue. 15.7 for Indonesia. For Russia, of course, 33.7. That makes sense. But even Brazil, right? So now you've got fiscal issues you've got to deal with associated with getting out of fossil. So now I'll go through a couple of examples that I think are illustrative kind of in this space and maybe get at some of the stuff that I mentioned. So here's for a low carbon transition in India. This was some work that colleagues at Imperial did. And it was looking at trying to move towards reducing coal, increasing solar over the next decade. And they just pointed out a couple of interesting things. So the National Thermal Power Corporation generates nearly a quarter of India's power. 90% of this is coal. So now you've got this national, you've got to figure out what to do about this electricity producer. Same thing, for example, in South Africa. Eskom, which is their utility in South Africa, is already having tremendous financial problems and now needs to retire a bunch of coal and then put in a bunch of renewable power. How do you do that, especially in the context of a nationalized? Obviously coal producer, but then this one's I find as an interesting example. Indian Railway, it's one of the largest railway systems in the world. Its top freight commodity is coal. For almost 50% of the revenue comes from coal. So now you've got a large entity critical to the operation of the country and the government. People are employed. It's going to be in trouble. Here's the conclusion: given the systemic importance of these firms to the Indian economy, these firm level risks may pose spillover risks to the sovereign. Right. So these are not just, again, these are really nitty gritty financial issues that have to be played through as we get out of it. Indonesia. So it's it's big country, big emitter, big exporter of coal, a lot in palm oil as well. So palm oil and coal, both of them associated with climate. Palm oil represented 13% of total exports in 2021. You've got to replace that. What are you going to replace it with? What's your economic transition? At the same time, they're sitting on very valuable reserves of nickel. They're in a good part of the world in some ways, in Southeast Asia for various supply chains. They've got a bunch of geothermal. You've got to figure out now how to transition from a coal-based or palm and coal-based economy towards something that maybe you can use the nickel, but maybe it has nothing to do with clean energy. Maybe what this new economy is going to be something different. But that's about economic development. That's about economic strategy, much less than it is just about climate strategy. And I think countries around the world, for what it's worth, they see now where things are going. They understand that as the future goes forward, the future is forward, but as we go forward into the future, these low carbon energy production is going to be the cheaper option. And capital is going to flow to where you can produce energy cheaper. And boy, if it's cheaper and you can claim that it's green, that's where companies are going to put their money. That is where it's headed. And countries realize that. But what do you do? How do you do that? How do you replace the revenues, right? How do you deal with actually all the transitions and jobs that are going to happen going through this? That's the kind of challenge that we're facing now today. And that's the kind of analysis that is needed and the kind of support that governments need. And if there's one thing I would focus on, one thing that I've learned in my job now, as we think about analysis, that's why I come from an analytical background and supporting government policymaking in that way. This is the kind of work that's needed. And frankly, it's not always there. The environmental economics community is now kind of trying to get into this space, which is kind of just economics in various different ways. But the sort of economics community that has to do with industrial strategy, trade, and so forth is just now coming towards the notion of realizing that climate is in that space and trying to figure it out. And we really haven't navigated into this. And I think that will be critical going forward. A couple more examples. Canada, I still have a student, I'm still a professor at Maryland, and one of my students is working on Canada. He's Canadian. And here you go. So oil and gas, 7.5% of Canada's GDP, but 30% for Alberta. And Canada has this interesting setup where the environmental issues are done at the federal level, but resources managed at the province level. And I think you know that Canada has in the past had issues about its sort of structure, that having to do with Quebec in the past. But now you're talking about a lot of serious issues going on about how do you navigate both what do you do about Alberta? How do they navigate forward? But also then that's raising issues at sort of a national level of a conflict between a state, a province and the national government. And of course, then so the federal government, Trudeau, is very climate friendly, but the Premier of Alberta is a strong supporter of the oil industry for obvious reasons. And so there's kind of an impasse and a lot of conflict at present. And this is just everywhere around the world. Let's take the US. So we're starting some work now with Columbia and RFF, but hopefully with a number of different folks about how do you think about fossil transitions, I should say transitions, economic transitions in fossil communities in the US. But there's a number of places in the US, Wyoming, Texas, and so forth, where we have communities where large proportions of the wages are coming from oil and gas. Now, some of those, we think about this in the US and we think about coal a lot of the time, coal communities, and they're screwed. But eventually we're talking about oil and gas as well. And how do we think about that? So this is, what I think is interesting about this is that we often think about these transitions just as national level issues. What's the federal policy to deal with? And that's true. And I think the IRA does a lot on energy communities and so forth. But a lot of this is about local economic development. That's a profession. There's economic development folks. Every one of these counties has their economic development agency, and they have economic development professionals. And the economic development professionals sometimes meet and talk about economic development and how do they create jobs and bring in investment. Those are their two biggest things, jobs and investment. How do you bring those in? So now you're talking about here, certainly a federal issue, but you're really talking also about community level transitions and what is the alternative economy? You take a dark place here. I don't know what these counties are, but they're dark. So over 30% of the wages. What is the new strategy for those counties to replace the economy they have today? And then just because we spend a lot of time on nature, just give an example from that space, Brazil. So I just grabbed a couple of things. We're doing work in Brazil. Let me explain this first, and then actually I'll mention it later because I think I come back to this. But The Amazon. This is really challenging, by the way. Super challenging. You talk about Indonesia, the Amazon, the Congo Basin. These are critical for climate, for biodiversity, right? We have tremendous poverty issues there. There's issues of crime. It's increasing, by the way, in, say, the Brazilian Amazon, criminality is. You have illegal mining. You also have poverty. You have joblessness. You have actually, I think in the Brazilian Amazon, I think it's a much younger population, employment. What's the economic model that allows you to maintain the forests going forward? Is it the bioeconomy that you're producing acai from the forests? Is it that you've actually gotten the cities around those areas to be richer? So there's a more, their ability to focus more on the environment. Is it that agriculture is sustainable agriculture? What's the strategy? So that's an economic development strategy. So there's a lot of work that obviously goes on what you call command and control when it comes to forests. Let's protect this much. We'll put it in a national park, conservation zone. In a place like this, you put it into the hands of indigenous folks because they've been pretty good at protecting the environment. But that's not the whole story because the pressures still stay. You need an alternative economic model. What's that economic model? Okay, so that was to go through some of these challenges. And if I was just to emphasize, I just want to emphasize that these are not what you would think about as sort of traditional environmental economics issues. These are issues around economic development, economic transformation, and that raises issues around fiscal policy, around trade policy, about labor policy, local economic development. Those are the issues that are at the core of the transition right now. Okay, so then I'm going to do something that's a little close to where I spend a lot of my time now, which is about economic thinking, which I think is another sort of obstacle to where we are. I shouldn't say obstacle, but it's something that needs to evolve quickly. To the extent that you believe economists are important, then it's important that they kind of continue to evolve. So here's the traditional view. Reducing emissions is costly. This is the notion. I mean, this is what we all learned. If you took environmental economics, if you want to reduce emissions, then what you have to do is use higher cost modes of production, but they produce less emissions. And in the end, that's good for you because it reduces emissions and that has an economic benefit. But to the first order, it's more costly. But is that really true in the long run now that we're seeing solar cells so cheap, batteries are cheap, you've got all this technology? Is it really true that that's the case? So this is from the IPCC. GDP in 2030 is 1.3 to 2.7% less than it would be otherwise if we just continued with status quo. And that's kind of a starting point for this. And it's actually interesting because the framing around the economics in, say, the IPC and all sorts of other venues is around the cost of mitigation. And then you end up with this fascinating phrase of negative costs, which means that, oh, maybe it's better for your economy. But you wouldn't even be using the phrase negative costs if you hadn't framed the whole thing as cost at the start. So, but there's alternative perspectives. So this is some work, and I'm not going to necessarily suggest we know this, by the way. I'm just going to suggest that framing it immediately at costs is maybe going a bit, is a bit old school. So this is just showing a scenario getting to net zero, and GDP is the second bar here. US goes down a little bit, high cost fossil producer, but in many places, it's actually, from this analysis, leading to increased GDP, going to net zero, okay? And why is this? Why would you even see something like this? So there's a couple things. Technology. Forecasts have consistently underestimated the advance of technology. So that's where we've gotten this in the past. Well, it was more expensive, but it's not so much anymore, and it's probably not going to be because costs are going to continue to go down for many of these technologies. This is work from folks at Oxford, and they just came up with a particular way of assessing future costs under uncertainty. When they do that, rapid green energy transition is likely to result in trillions in net savings. Okay? Here's from, this is from the Climate Change Development Report for Turkey. The World Bank does these climate change development reports. And they have some very good economists that work on this. Here we go, climate action could provide nearly 100 billion in savings for Turkey. And I think the key thing I want to point out here is incorporating the way the climate links to other priorities is really important. A lot of this here is from reduced air pollution, but it also contributes to energy security and lower energy expenditures. So these other benefits are often not accounted for. In analyses, they need to be as well. And I'll just note in many places, of course, air pollution is the primary reason for climate action, not climate. Study that was done recently on the Amazon found that moving to a lower forest protecting economy would create 312,000 additional jobs, and and so on and so forth. The only thing I want to mention about this one, there's a number of things, but the informal economy is enormous there. And so one of the advances here was to put the informal economy into the social accounting matrix, into the accounting that's used to assess policies. That wasn't there. And if it's not there, if it's not in the national accounts, how do the national accounts then make policies that are going to be effective for the Amazon if you don't even have much of the Amazon economy? And I don't mean just, by the way, in the forest. When we talk about the Amazon, we're talking about the states of the Amazon, which includes in the forest, near the forest, the cities. Those are all part of an ecosystem, an economic ecosystem. So just making sure you have the proper data, getting into the accounts. I showed this earlier. I think one of the things that's fascinating to me is it still hasn't kind of made it into everyone's mind that status quo is risky. Sticking with the status quo investment in fossil-based economies going forward is risky because, again, capital is going to flow. Capital's flowing towards clean energy, and capital in industry, as you start to think about scope 2 emissions, you start to think about not just the direct emissions, but the emissions from your sources of energy or your supply chains. As you start to think about those, and those are accounted for, and companies can invest and say, hey, I invested in green production. This television was made from green production. They're going to want to invest in places that are, if they're cheaper, that's great. And if they're cheaper and green, that's really great too. So staying invested in a fossil economy actually potentially has risks as well. And I don't think those are really thought of. The sort of paradigm is, well, status quo is safe. Reducing emissions is risky. But in fact, that's not necessarily true, right? And as I make these arguments, I'm not making the arguments that, oh, it's more risky to stay in one and less in the other. I'm just saying that some of these sort of beliefs have not totally caught up, and they make their way into the way we do analysis, the way we provide advice, and so forth. And then there's just basic beliefs about how economies work. So I'm trying to figure out how to say this one in a way that's not super technical. So there's a way of thinking about the economy where it's optimal. Everything's working great. There's no $20 bills on the sidewalk. And in that case, when you invest in changing your economy, well, you're actually moving away from a great situation that was perfect because, of course, we're in a market equilibrium. Everything's great, everything's worked out. Resources are being allocated efficiently. The market's doing the pricing right and all this sort of stuff. You're going to be crowding out. When you move resources into one thing, they're being taken from somewhere else. There's an alternative view that, in fact, there is probably a lot of ways that we're probably not in that sort of optimal equilibrium. And in fact, we could be, by making investments, going out after failures to put in sufficient investment in certain areas. We could be driving technology more effectively and so forth. You see a lot of this out of Europe, by the way, but very little out of the US. And not to say one is right or wrong, but I would say that there are now basic questions about this. And some of the folks that have been doing this kind of work are now being brought into the World Bank to try and as part of the goals of getting in some of this. And some of this has to do with, can you just keep borrowing and investing and then pay it back later. In one perspective, if you do that, what you're going to do is crowd out investment. Another perspective is, no, you won't really crowd out investment. There's actually slack, and you can actually, you won't crowd out resources. You can actually drive economic growth. So I just want to put on the table here that there are some questions just about how economies work that probably need to be more open today than they were in the past. Okay, so I think I'm probably have timed this roughly correctly. So those are the things I wanted to go over today. Oh, I again wanted to mention we're focused on trying to get the different folks who do these kinds of work together in one room. And a lot of them are working for finance ministries or economic ministries, but getting them in one room to compare methods and actually come up with some way of thinking about that. On the Amazon, we're investing, and potentially in the Congo, but in the Amazon, we're investing in university and think tank research in the Amazonian states to support local decision making and try and figure out what are the economic solutions there. We'll probably do some investments as well in the bioeconomy, which one can think about quite broadly. If you have questions, I can discuss this. Okay, so I want to make sure I mention some of those things again. Here's the summary again. Transition's happening now. But don't think about it as climate change mitigation. Think about it as low carbon economic transition. Okay? It's about economic transitions. That's what this is about, and that's where the challenges lie in making this happen. That being true, climate policy is not just environmental policy, it's trade policy, it's labor, it's fiscal policy, industrial policy, local economic development. I hope I showed some of the challenges having to do with these issues. And then finally, the economic thinking then, where we are, needs to be evolving along with this evolving context around climate action. And that's not just in the narrative about whether it's good or not, but actually just in our ability to answer the questions that are being asked today, which are these kinds of questions. Do we have the ability to answer those? And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
So I'll start with the first question, and then we'll turn to the audience, and we'll go until 1:15. So I want to focus your attention a little bit on this challenge when we think about decarbonization through industrial policy and trade policy. Let's take the case of solar. One could say that 20 years ago, when the Germans were ambitious in subsidizing the deployment of solar, part of that was to try to support a solar manufacturing industry in Germany. That didn't really play out the way they envisioned. They built a lot of solar. At the time, they got criticized for spending a lot of money on solar. Yeah. But one thing it did, it created a market for manufacturers, as it turned out, a lot of them based in China, but manufacturers to make investment in their capacity and the technology, drive down the cost. A lot of that, the sort of learning by doing in manufacturing was enabled by policies that were generous for solar, whether it was Germany 20 years ago or starting about 15 years ago in the US and Japan. And
PURPA in the 70s.
Wait, if we want to go way back, yes, we can go back to PURPA in 78. So the challenge there, of course, is we've been able to see some of those benefits, the spillovers around the world. India now has installed a ton of solar that probably the models you used to run a decade ago would not have envisioned, or because of how much the costs have come down. But some of that's also because we enable that trade across countries. A lot of the last few years, there has been concerns about where we manufacture the goods and where then they are used. And whether it is the prospect of a carbon border adjustment from the EU, whether it's the US providing subsidies, targeting more domestic manufacturing and using domestic manufactured content. When we think about decarbonization and industrial policy, do you have concerns, or do you think, no, wait, here are some ways to deal with these potential challenges so that the next generation of technologies will be adopted broadly, even if they're primarily being developed in country A or country B? So I'd like to get your thoughts on how we think about that next generation of technologies, if it's next generation battery storage or what have you, that we're going to be able to really diffuse those technologies around the world, or do we think there's going to be this kind of focus on domestic production, whether it's here in the US or in other countries, and that may slow down decarbonization?
That's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to it. I mean, I guess I can riff on it a little bit. I think, I guess the first comment is that I do think that trade and industrial policy are inseparable, the same thing. I mean, they are the same thing. I think that as, so this is not going to answer your question. I would assert that in some sense, to a first order, you probably are in a situation where, of course, free trade and that simplicity of that is valuable for low cost mitigation and so forth. But it's going to then be in all the nitty gritty that matters, right? There's going to be the challenges, again, all the ones I discussed about what is your alternative economy? How do you actually move your economy? That turns out to be important for countries to take action, right? So that's going to be very, very critical. And so I guess my sense of it is that, oh, and then actually, I thought there was one more I wanted to mention. Then there's supply chains. There's supply chain risk. I mean, you're not just doing this for economic reasons. You're doing it for economic security, national security reasons as well, right? So I guess I think the answer to that question, which is that the proper way of thinking about this is as a multi-attribute situation where your objective is not simply free trade at lowest cost, but is one that is also about ensuring economic growth in particular places that can be part of this, about managing your energy security and your supply chains and your supply chain risk at the same time. And I don't think we've figured that out. I do think there is a risk that countries, there's a reason why why industrial policy at times has not been in vogue, because you can actually make mistakes. And that is quite possible in the current space. The one example I'll give, it's not really in play yet, but it's potentially in play. It seems as if every country who has a lot of solar power believes they're now going to become a hydrogen hub and ship hydrogen around the world. If you start making those investments, I don't think we have enough demand. It's not even clear that you can ship it. So I think that does, to me, that's potentially part of the risk, is maybe that, as much as do we get low cost mitigation and so forth. I mean, we spend a lot of time on efficiency. I'm not sure that's actually where the issue is. A lot of the issue is going to be these other questions of, are you going to make mistakes, right, and so forth, rather than is there an efficiency argument. I'm not sure the efficiency argument is actually the main argument. Frankly, it's going to be about nation states or whatever entities competing, and some of them making bad mistakes and ending up in a bad spot. And that can have, knock-on consequences. That's my off-the-cuff answer.
Okay.
We're trying to figure this out.
Yep.
The question is, where do we engage in trade as we think about these issues? Where should philanthropy be focused in the trade space? And I don't think we've got that figured out yet.
Great. Let me open it up for questions here in the audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much for great presentation. I have I teach environmental economics, and I completely agree with you. And some stuff I find really redundant. So I was thinking about, when you mentioned that economic thinking needs to evolve, what do you can you give example? Some stuff is redundant, or we should pick up new things, both maybe in research or in teaching, or what do you mean? Like, maybe you could give
you're saying on the ground. Gosh, I kind of hoped I showed some of it here. There's all these things, right? So, I mean, I come from the community. I mean, there's definitely some sort of teaching, but mostly graduate students. I mean, I work with graduate students and so forth. But in the space of providing actual guidance, I mean, all of the things I articulated. So one is, I think that you've got a whole set of questions now. They're about trade, questions you asked. I don't think we know the answer to that, right? There's questions about, fiscal issues. How do you do that? So those are the questions that are actually being asked. So that's number one, is that we need to find a way to answer those questions. So do you teach that in your environmental economics class? Probably not. So is it that we need to get that more involved into the other parts of the economics curriculum to ask from sort of a university perspective? So that's one. I like to think about this as narrative and implementation. On implementation, we don't have the ability to answer many of the most important questions. We've been answering questions for energy and environmental ministries for many years. And now it's central banks, finance ministries, economic ministries who are asking the questions because it's serious now. And they don't have the tools. And so there's just kind of that. How do you deal with the implementation issues? And then there's this whole set of narrative issues that I just think are, they fit within the economics paradigm. You can just say that instead of the marginal abatement cost curve going this, it might go down a little bit and come up in some way, whatever. It fits, but it's not the thinking. And it's not even, I think in many places, I come from a background where we do something for, I don't know who knows about computable general equilibrium modeling. If you come from that background, you wouldn't even think about this. And in some sense, this is anathema. Now, it's not to say that you might not believe that there could be different ways of thinking about whether you are or not in equilibrium. But it's just sort of a mindset, and that mindset perpetuates throughout. And I mean, that's all of these. So I guess, sorry, I'm getting off track, but I think the narrative is something that can be addressed in sort of environmental, in the way we teach environmental economics in the context of where we are now. The implementation to me is about engaging a much broader set of people. It's the development economics people, and trade and so forth in this problem. And if you really want to be doing it now, this is a multidisciplinary problem. That's great for universities, but incredibly challenging for universities to do stuff that's interdisciplinary.
Hi, thank you. Alicia Harley, a senior research fellow here at the Kennedy School. Interesting talk. I was surprised by it. It wasn't exactly what I was expecting. I was expecting to come and hear more about what you guys are doing. And it was interesting that you came with sort of what are these big challenges? And it seems like the Bezos Fund is really grappling with how to engage. Whereas the whole time was sort of what's the theory of change that you guys are working with? And the way I sort of would sum up what you were talking about is, at least in the end, a lot of these transitions will have to be local and place-based, and regional policymakers, federal policymakers will have to be involved. So I guess all of that to me means you really need to build capacity of local governments, of regional governments, of federal governments to do this kind of work. So I wonder how Amazon, or how the fund is thinking, about that issue of like building the capacity of others. Because that's what it seems like you came down on, is we can't just leave it in the realm of like, marginal cost of carbon or anything like that. We have to bring it down to the people actually doing the work in various different policies.
So a couple of comments. One is there is no silver bullet. So I mean, that's something we've known forever, and it's like many, many problems, that's true. So there's no silver bullet. So it is many things. I mean, if we're talking about trade issues, we need to be talking about trade with people who work with the WTO or trade people, right? So to me, there's, if you're talking about fiscal issues, a lot of that could be local, but a lot of that is national governments and so forth. But I agree with you. And as the Earth Fund, a lot of our focus is actually to focus on local capacity. I would not say that it comes down to just that, but I would say that's a critical part of it. And I'll make a couple of comments on that. So one is I think a lot of it is local economic transitions, and how do you do those? But that, even in the US, that would be federal and local policymaking. But if you go and think in a lot of countries, emerging, developing economies, a lot of philanthropic funding doesn't flow to domestic institutions. It flows to Harvard to work with some domestic institutions. But the locus is, or the big NGOs, they go in. And it's not actually building the domestic capacity. So a lot of our focus has been to not actually work through the big NGOs, but to try and work actually directly with the folks on the ground and build that capacity. My own stuff, so just to go on your point, working in the Amazon on trying to build up local university and NGO capacity. Same with the Congo. Even in the US, we're working in fossil communities, trying to get in some of the state universities that are local to be engaged. So I would agree with you that a lot of it has to do with building up the local capacity to answer these questions, but I will also say there just is no silver bullet. If there was a focus for this talk, it's that I think there is a big play. And there is a big play here, and the big play is around moving the economics community broadly writ to be able to address these issues. And that means the two things I said, the implementation capacity to answer the questions that are being asked and altering the narrative to be more up to date with where we are. I do actually think that's a very big play for what it's worth. So yes, I would not giving you just a list of what we do at the Earth Fund. I apologize about this, but this gives you a sense for what it's worth. This is how we're thinking about what we need to do about economics, how we want to engage in the economics community. And again, I do think myself and certainly the folks I work for believe that that is a big idea to try and move in this direction.
Hi, I'm Margaret Williams with the Arctic Initiative here. And my question is more from the environmental policy point of view. I actually also live in Alaska, where 90% of our budget has been based on the fossil fuel industry. And our governor is now trying to promote the development of rare earth and other minerals as a part of this green transition. And in Greenland and in Norway, there are many intact, some of the last intact areas of wild nature are now targeted because of the presence of these minerals. And I'm wondering how much you are hearing about that and how to the extent to which these concerns are being integrated into this decision-making, and how much at Bezos you hear about that, because Bezos has been a huge promoter of protection of the last remaining wild places on the planet. Thank you.
Well, first, thanks for coming from Alaska to hear me talk. I appreciate that. Yeah, actually, it's a big conversation I'll just say in the philanthropic community in general. It's a very big conversation now, and I think it gets kind of back to this whole trade thing in some sense. But when we think about it, you get folks who think about trade issues, and it's related. How you're going to produce the stuff in a place and send it somewhere else. They think about it in the context of efficiency. There's others who spend, and that comes up a lot. Another thing that comes up a lot is supply chain risk and ensuring. And then another that would come up is sort of not necessarily sort of sovereign supply chain risk, but risk that we can't produce enough and we won't be able to do the transition rapidly enough. And then what comes up is what you just said. I'm not saying last, but as part of that conversation, that's a core part of the conversation. It's like, especially for us, who focuses a lot on indigenous lands, a lot of this is in indigenous lands. How do you do that? So what I would suggest is that's a priority. It's a priority of the philanthropic community, but it's quite a tension. It's an incredible tension. And I don't think, my personal perspective is, like so many of the issues we're facing now as we move to this transition being real and rapid, we have not figured it out. And what I sit in on these conversations, they're asking the same question as you. What do you do? And what's the way to do sustainable mining, right? And to make sure when you're doing the sustainable mining, that in fact the local communities are not just producers of raw materials and then buyers of finished products, but in fact get to take some of the actual economic gains themselves. How do you even think about that? So all I'm doing here is agreeing with you, saying that there's multiple objectives that are in play, and that this is something that everyone is now struggling with because you wouldn't even be thinking about it 3 or 4 years ago. And they're thinking about it now. And it's a core part of the conversation. And certainly is for us, again, because we focus a ton on nature and we focus on indigenous communities.
Hello, I'm Victoria. I'm a student here at MPA. I was wondering, I looked up the 10 principles the Earth Fund has, and I was wondering maybe you can share some additional details on how you actually decide on what to invest on. Maybe you have a framework of quantifying the impact, the potential impact a project could have, or something around that. Thank you.
Sounds great. Our goal for is to protect land and to reduce emissions, so that and to do it in an equitable way. Those are the primary ways that we would evaluate. I guess I can riff on a couple of thoughts about that. One is that different philanthropies have different ways of thinking about the way they would engage with that. I think we're a philanthropy that is interested in coming up and testing ideas that could be big ideas going forward. So we're less inclined to just sort of fund into something, everyone's funding into it, and to sort of, I mean, we will do everything, don't get me wrong, but there's a sort of day-to-day, hand-to-hand combat of policy and so forth. I think we think all very much about, can we think of big ideas, new technologies, new ways of thinking that can then scale. So it's not just like, how much would you get in terms of forest? How much would you get in terms of climate? It's also very much about what's your sort of philosophy of change. Do you want to do a lot of small, risky investments and see if some of them can play big? And I think we sit much more in that space. What's the big idea that will make a change going forward? In general, it's fascinating now being in philanthropy to see how you think about measurement. And every philanthropy has a different way of doing it. Some are incredibly rigorous, mathematical models, lots of detail. You got to put in all these assumptions and then it spits out a number, maybe a distribution. Others, it's much more conversational. There's no sort of, it's actually, for what it's worth, it's an intellectual area of exploration. How to measure in a either ex ante or ex post way, how to do it. I think we lean I think we lean a little bit towards the notion of trying to figure out as what would be a big idea. Think about it. The other thing I'll say is, I mean, what do you do about stuff that's really, really diffuse? Training. How do you're going to train? We have put a bunch of money into well, not a bunch, but some money into something called apolitical, which is training government officials around climate. How do we measure the impact of that, right? So that's you know, in some sense that has to do with belief systems or narratives that tell you a story about how it can make a difference. So that's also another way that it's done. It's not just, can you plug it into a model and spit out a number? But again, I think for us, it leans towards that narrative. What's a big change we can make? How do we think about what those would be? What's a really innovative idea? We lean pretty heavily towards that sort of space. Ideas, big ideas.
We have time for one more very short.
Okay, probably a short answer is what that's what he really means.
I'll try and be really quick. Hi, I'm Eli. I'm a fellow at the Kennedy School. You said in your presentation two things that I completely agree with, but logically on Economics 101, they shouldn't both be able to be true at the same time. And one was that you have lots and lots of investment that can't find bankable projects, but then you have lots of projects which the cost of capital is too high and they can't find investment. And I think this happens a lot at places like COP and other big international forums. You have emerging markets saying our cost of capital is too high, no one's investing. And then all the development banks are saying, we can't find any projects to invest in. And it seems like probably the answer hinges on something to do with what is bankability. And that's the word you used on your slide. And you mentioned, I think, a contribution to a $250 million alliance that, as far as I got, was kind of solving this question. And I wonder what you think is going on here, where you have both too much and too little capital, and how do we solve it?
Too much capital demand, but not enough flowing. Is that what you mean? Yeah, there's tremendous demand. You know, it's not fully my area of expertise, so I want to be careful to say what I can. Let me see if I can say anything. Yeah, I'm trying to think if I can say anything intelligent about this. I'm not sure I can. So, so your question is, how do we think about? Right. Why does it not just happen? I'm not going to be able to give you an answer to that. All I can say is there's a lot of sort of very detailed and, again, nitty-gritty issues like what we're talking about. It's risky to invest in the project prep, you know, in the early project prep. Okay, we can take that risk and show that actually there is an investment that can be made in that. There's issues about the pooled procurement, which I mentioned. We're investing in that. The prices are actually higher, right? Because you don't have pooled, basically, it's too hard to do that. To me, I mean, I've been having to learn about this. My take is there, again, there's no silver, but it's a lot of this nitty gritty stuff like this. Or, let's say you're trying to invest in bioeconomy in the Amazon. There's a lot of money in Brazil that's actually ready to flow into that. But is there really in the Amazon the set of entrepreneurs that need to be there? Okay, that's maybe a training thing. Or maybe there's some local, and that's actually an issue. We have the money, but there aren't enough, it's not just bankable projects. It's also just business expertise in the region. To me, it's come down to this. I'm not an expert in this, but it's come down to it being a lot of those little things that have to be worked through. So yeah, they're not matched up because there's just a lot of, I don't know, it's market failures, but obstacles that need to be overcome to make it work. But you may know more about it than I do. It's not my area of expertise.
So before we wrap up, let me remind
You that this is the last seminar of the semester. We will reconvene in the spring semester. Sometime late January, we'll circulate the schedule for the spring. And finally, please join me in thanking Leon Clarke for his presentation today. Thank you, Leon. That's great.
All right. All right. Is it good?
Yeah.
All right, good. Okay.